got to get value for money, you've got to get bang for your buck. So what are the policies that make the biggest difference? To actually know that, you've got to gather the data, and you've got to both publish data in advance to say this is why we're making certain policy decisions, but also track policy as it goes through and evaluate it in the longer term. The UK is doing some interesting work in this area. 2 initiatives. One is the What Works centres, 5 or 6 centres of excellence looking at different policy agendas and bringing academics and policymakers together to say what do we know about local economic growth and what actually works and what doesn't work, or what do we know about living with an ageing population. And academics often know things, but they don't get translated into policy at the right time. So that's quite a useful initiative, I think. The other one, which is quite fascinating, is the use of randomized control trials. And some of you may have come across, we now have a behavioral insights team in the UK based in the Cabinet Office. And what they've been doing is looking at ways in which you can make relatively small changes in public policy delivery, which might have a significant impact. And as an example, one thing that they did was vary the letter that the tax office sent out for those people who were paying late. And just changing some of the wording, for example, to reflect the fact that other people in your area have already paid, led to 90% changes in people making the payment. And they were able to do this in a randomized control trial way. So they could send 50 letters out of one batch, well, 50, I mean, you know, thousands in one, thousands in another, and then compare the response rates. So in these sorts of areas, you can actually get very high-quality feedback as to how policy changes. Now, I mean, this works best in very micro changes. You know, once you get into complex social policy fields, it becomes much more complicated. What's the best intervention to change how you teach maths in schools is more complicated to evaluate. But these tools are being explored by governments at the moment, and I think that, again, there's something for the finance professionals to be able to drive some of these changes and to engage with some of those changes from a kind of performance management perspective. The one caveat I'd add, though, on this is that public perceptions can be quite tricky when it comes to the evidence. So the RSS, did some research earlier this year, and we asked the pollsters Ipsos Mori to look at the areas where public perceptions were out of kilter with the evidence. And just to give you 2 examples, people thought that teenage pregnancies in the UK were running at 15%. In fact, 0.6% of girls under the age of 16 are pregnant at any time. So people's perceptions of reality were really out of kilter with the evidence. Another example was the aid budget, the overseas aid budget. 26% of the UK population thought that this was one of the government's 2 or 3 biggest items of expenditure. Now, those of you who will know anything about UK spend will know this is a relatively small, it's about 1% of expenditure. Far more people thought that aid was a big item than pensions, whereas pensions is really one of the big ticket items, as you will all know. So even if you do gather the evidence and the data, actually what the public make of it, there is always a massive communications challenge there. So I think that that's something that we, as the numbers people, have to be aware of, that even though we might know what the evidence tells us, that kind of technocratic vision isn't enough to carry the public, and there's important work to be done to actually ensure that the public understands what the evidence tells us. 2 other areas where I just wanted to touch upon before I finish. One was open data. Open data and big data tend to be used in the same breath, but they're slightly different. Big data is talking about just the amount of data that is out there and how it might be used more effectively. Open data is really all about making government data sets open to the public for their own reuse. And this has a number of different strands or drivers. One is transparency, so just publishing things so that you are accountable as a public sector to the citizens that you should be accountable to. But it's also about innovation. So for example, transport is probably the area where we've seen the most effects, where data has been given over to the public. As a result, on your phone now, you can use apps to check when the next bus is arriving, or where there are delays on your public transport, etc. If you go back 5 or 10 years ago, it just seemed inconceivable that we would have access on our phones to that kind of data. And as we can kind of make more and more real-time data accessible, there will be other innovations like that which will just make the lives of citizens better. And there was a recent Open Data Summit in the UK, which brought together, I think, 80 countries from around the world. So there's a real building appetite for this agenda, not just in the UK, but worldwide. And I think, again, it will have an impact on you as finance professionals, because this transparency agenda, I mean, the first time that the UK started publishing all of this, the spend, the media were all over it saying, you know, such and such council has been spending X amount of money on Y, on hiring race courses or whatever it might be. So again, there is an opportunity for a kind of public backlash and a need for us as the numbers people to be able to explain what the numbers actually mean and put them in some context. The final thing I want to touch on before I finish is performance management, and this obviously links with the other things that I've been talking about, but recently a think tank called the Institute for Government, which is a well-respected a think tank looking at government performance in the UK, published a Whitehall monitor looking at the performance of central government and how much you can actually glean from the information that's out there. And what it said is that when you look at the inputs, i.e. the money that's going in, we've got a fairly good handle on budgets, although we're less good at understanding assets. We still don't quite know every building that we own or where they all are. But the picture worsens once you start looking at outputs. What does the money buy you and what happens as a result? We tend to be quite good when we're doing new special projects to say, well, how we're going to track them, but less good at measuring business as normal performance, and also for projects when they become behind schedule, actually understanding and kind of giving the data out about that is an area of weakness. And then finally, when you turn to outcomes, i.e. how does the resources that you've created create change on the ground, this is just something we're pretty weak at, telling that story and mapping that change. So again, that's, I think, an area where there's going to be greater opportunity and greater pressure over time. So by way of conclusion, data are becoming more important for the public sector, partly because they're more available, there's just more data, so that's the sort of big data agenda, but also because of the pressures around value for money, transparency, evidence-based policy making, and so forth. Finance professionals, I think, have an important role to play in generating insight from this data, but I think it might imply some changes for the way that your profession works. There's something about working more in partnership with other bits of the public sector, the statisticians, the analytics people, and also focusing more on the strategy. I think it might mean looking more at new data sets which are not traditional for finance professionals to be looking at. And I think most importantly, the opportunity for you is to reposition yourselves from a kind of back office reporting function to a front office strategic business intelligence function, and that's what I urge you to do. Thank you very much.